Today on Let's Play D&D, we're going to talk about miniatures. Should you use miniatures for your Dungeons & Dragons campaign? Hi everyone, my name is Nick Alamonos, and I have been a Dungeon Master for about 30 years since 1st edition. The person that introduced me to D&D, all he gave me was his Dungeon Master's Guide. This is the Dungeon Master's Guide that was written in 1979. And he gave me a little book of his campaign notes. And so when I started playing, I didn't even know that miniatures existed. Now, there were some miniatures that you could find in some hobby stores. A lot of them were made out of pewter, but they were really hard to find. Even the books were hard to find. It took me a while to track down a monster manual and then later a player's handbook. It was actually the last book I got was a player's handbook. So imagine trying to figure out Dungeons & Dragons 1st edition on your own and all you have is a Dungeon Master's Guide. That was really, really challenging. And the guy that introduced me to the game, he basically played 1 half-hour game with us just to give us the gist of it, and then he left. 2nd edition, 3rd edition, played a little bit of 4th edition, almost never really used miniatures. And it was really only until 5th edition that I decided to embrace miniatures, especially since miniatures just kind of exploded in stores. Like, I love toys. I actually grew up with He-Man and G.I. Joe and Transformers. And one of the reasons that I got into Dungeons & Dragons is because I felt that it was a way for me to continue playing pretend. And that's kind of like how I describe D&D to friends and family who don't play. I say, it's like playing pretend with math. Oftentimes, using miniatures is a double-edged sword. It's really cool to be able to put a cool figure or a cool monster miniature on the table, and you can kind of impress your players. They can go, ooh. So if you have a miniature, you can say, well, you know what, I got this figure. I have this cool Medusa figure. Maybe I can make a story all about this Medusa. Another thing I like about miniatures is that it's tactile. It's something that will engage with your senses. It's something you can touch, you can feel. It can help your players, immerse your players into knowing exactly where they are on the field, which is kind of difficult to do when it's just theater of the mind. I mean, you can tell your players, okay, you're in a dungeon and you're in a room, and the room is certain dimensions, and there's a door there, and there's a door here, and there's 2 skeletons walking down this hallway. But it's kind of hard without any miniatures to kind of know exactly where your character's standing. In my earlier video, I talked about the different types of campaigns that you can play, and one of them was the epic battle, where you have lots and lots of pieces on the terrain, similar to playing a game of Warhammer. And what miniatures is great for is for that type of scenario, especially when in Dungeons & Dragons, a lot of times range and reach are so important. So knowing exactly, well, am I exactly 5 feet away from this guy, or if this is, can this, orc hit me with his club? He's 10 feet away. Am I exactly 10 feet away from him? That's hard to do without miniatures. They're fun to paint. They're fun to have to display on your shelf. If you are someone who likes collecting toys like I do, that's just one more little, tiny little toys it's just fun to have. The cons to miniatures, it's oftentimes paradoxical because it's the same as the pros but flipped. For example, while miniatures can look great, they can also look really terrible. If you are not very good at creating a setup, or if you're not really good at painting figures, it can actually look worse than what the players might be visualizing in their heads. Instead of being more immersive, it can be less immersive. If you are trying to describe a very terrifying scenario to your players where zombies are crawling out of the ground and they're slinking toward you, in the player's imagination, that might be a terrifying situation. But if you are putting down a little tiny plastic let's say, poorly painted zombie figure on the table, they're going to be looking at that and they're going to be saying, oh, that doesn't look very scary. Whenever I see someone will post his huge Dwarven Forge setup on Facebook, and he'll be like, man, check this out. I have this huge city and this castle in the background and a port with ships and a forest and this huge dungeon, which is, laid out on a 10-foot table, and it looks amazing. It looks like, wow. And this is, if anyone familiar with Dwarven Forge knows, the Dwarven Forge can get really, really expensive. If you want a good-sized dungeon with maybe dozens of rooms and hallways, you might spend up to $1,000 on Dwarven Forge dungeon setup. And if you're going to have, an entire city of Dwarven Forge, you might end up spending $10,000. So the funny thing to me is, imagine spending $10,000 on this amazing setup, showing it to your players, and then the players going, you know what, we don't really like this town. How about we're just going to leave and go to a different place. One of the things that'll happen to me often is that I'll have a really cool miniature, and because I spent a lot of money on it, or I spent a lot of time building it or painting it, I want to use it as often as possible. So something like this, for instance, I try to space it out as much as possible, but the players kind of remember these little mini setups, and it kind of ends up becoming a running joke where it's like, oh, gee, that house sure looks familiar. That's a really popular design. It seems like everywhere we go, we just keep running into the same looking tavern and the same looking house. Let's say the players aren't that interested in going to the castle, or they're not that interested in going to the village. Maybe they want to go somewhere, and the dungeon master doesn't have miniatures to represent the things that the players want to do. So in this regard, miniatures can actually limit the options that you give to the players, and that kind of takes away from what makes Dungeons and Dragons great, which is that you can go anywhere and do anything. You really only need to play is the player's handbook and some dice. One set of dice can be shared among all the players, and one player's handbook can be shared with all the players. And I remember back in first edition days, this is all we had. And the only real expense was buying graph paper. That's really all I needed to do, is buy graph paper and pens and pencils. And that was it. We drew our own characters, and sometimes we even designed our own monsters. So D&D can be very, very inexpensive. But when you start getting into miniatures, then D&D can get very, very expensive. Each little monster figure you put on the table costs $6 to $10 depending on how big that monster is. And then you got to pay for brushes, and you got to pay for paint. If you don't have a lot of time as a dungeon master to write out a story and design maps and stuff, then you don't want to be spending your time painting a figure. Some miniatures are way more useful than others. So if it's something like a tree or a generic looking house, it's a campaign like Middle-earth where there's a lot of orcs and goblins, then having a bunch of orcs and goblins on hand is really useful. If it's something like a dungeon, a generic looking dungeon tile or a generic looking door, that's something I can use over and over and over again. If we're talking about perhaps a figure that a player is going to use, then yeah, by all means, paint that figure as good as you can. This cost me about $10, and let's say I spent about an hour painting that chimera so that I could put it in front of my players and they could kill that chimera in 10 minutes. Was it worth an hour painting this thing and spending the money for this thing for a 10-minute fight? Seems better to just open up the Dungeon Master's Guide, show them a picture of the chimera and say, here it is. That's all you really need to know. So what's the solution? Should you use miniatures or should you use theater of the mind? My advice is to use a mixture of both. If you have a game where your players are going through a dungeon and there's a lot of enemies, then I would say definitely want to use miniatures for that situation. But if you have a game where your players are going to be, maybe traveling through a city, and they're going to be meeting a lot of merchants and doing a lot of charisma checks and persuasion checks and things like that, and investigation. There, I think that the miniatures really aren't going to be as important. I think if you really can't interact with those miniatures, I think that it's probably best in that instance to use Theater of Mind. So that is my thoughts on using miniatures. I hope you found this video useful. And if you did, please like, share, or leave a comment and tell me what are your thoughts on using miniatures in Dungeons & Dragons.